My name is Evangeline Payne, and I'm about to enter into my final year of studying my English Literature PhD at the University of Sheffield. My paper today is called The Undoing of the Scandinavian Utopia in Larsson's Millennium Trilogy. Before we begin, I've just compiled a brief list of potential trigger warnings that may arise for people during this presentation. The Scandinavian concept of the welfare state has been, since the 1960s, revered by many in Britain. British writer David Pritchard describes it as a place of haunting natural beauty, a utopian society where blonde-haired, beautiful people lead idyllic lives. However, with the growth of the import and translation of Scandinavian texts, the noughties arguably resulted in the shattering of the rose-tinted glasses through which the Scandinavian utopia has previously been observed. Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy was arguably one of the most successful imports that exposed the dark, gritty underbelly of the seemingly utopian welfare state. Larsson's texts, following bankrupt tabloids, corrupt governments, and uncovering an underground sex trafficking ring, highlight in the extreme the issues that should be impossible in the utopia that the Swedish government had once promoted. Larsson's story tells of the titular character, Lisbeth Salander, who has been falsely deemed incompetent by her government, who are supposed to be protecting her. After her former guardian suffers a stroke, she is placed with a new guardian who blackmails and exploits her and subjects her to aggressive sexual assaults. Eventually, she uses violence and her unusually impressive skills as a hacker to blackmail him into recommending that she eventually be released from this guardianship. This proves that she was too competent to ever require a guardianship, highlighting from the outset of this trilogy that Elizabeth has been the victim of an injustice under the Swedish welfare state, and insinuating already that there is a monumental failing in Scandinavia that has been permitted in this apparent utopia. Elizabeth goes on to become the woman who hates men who hate women, in the final book, The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. This is a clever and successful nod to the original Scandinavian title of the first book, Man som hatar kvinnor, translated literally as Men Who Hate Women. This exposes a blatant sexism in Sweden that has either been overlooked by or hidden from those viewing the Scandinavian utopia from the outside. Not only does Elizabeth expose these corrupt men, but she ultimately reveals and tackles the corrupt patriarchy that still exists in the apparent utopia of Sweden. The dream and the vision of Scandinavia and the millions who thrive there is undermined by the mindscape of just one individual who cannot conform to the injustices she sees. It is this element of Elizabeth's psychology, her sense not only of justice, but of equality and gender equality alike, that is a part of her international appeal. Ironically, it is also a major contributor to her downfall in the texts, but the thing that has ensured her fame worldwide as a unique and much admired character. This presentation will look at how Elizabeth and her unique mindscape are powerful enough to undo the image of a Scandinavian utopia. For reference, I will only be looking at the Millennium Trilogy titles written by Stieg Larsson himself: The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Girl Who Played with Fire, and The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest, published in Scandinavia from 2005 to 2007, and translated in the UK around 2009. With her unusual and often anti-patriotic mindscape, Lisbeth Salander is not revolutionary in Nordic noir though. On the contrary, forerunners of the genre, Mars Chauvel and Pa Value, introduced a series of nonconformist, controversial female characters in their 1965 to 75 Martin Beck series. Feisty female police officers, bereft widows who spring back and embody ultimate strength and resilience, and a young mother called Rebecca Lind are a few of these characters. Rebecca is a protagonist in their final title of the 10-book series, The Terrorists. Here, she fails to grasp the intricacies of the conventional social structure of the welfare state. Intricacies such as marriage, work, and taxation. This lack of understanding, reflected also in Larsson's Elizabeth Salander, ensures that she is isolated and abandoned by both her family and the government, ultimately provoking her to assassinate the Prime Minister at the climax of the text, in the hope that a more socialist or charitable one in her eyes will follow. Her isolation here not only exemplifies the issues of the utopian welfare state, but her unusual mindscape is used as a literary device to highlight the shortcomings of the state and how they prevent those with unique or unusual mindscapes from fitting in. These are shortcomings such as those highlighted in the 2010 Gerda survey, which found there was a prevalence of both objective and subjective income poverty among older women compared to that of men. There are also shortcomings that further this point about taxation. This high taxation is highlighted in the article from the Journal of Economic Perspectives called How Can Scandinavians Tax So Much? The journal investigates how Scandinavian countries are able to impose a very high tax rate and still perform strongly. However, there is still debate about whether this is beneficial for businesses, for individuals, for the government itself. For example, entrepreneurs and new businesses pay a huge tax. There is also a personal tax rate in Sweden of up to 57.2%, and a tax wedge for single workers of 42.7%, which is significantly higher than other European countries and America. Shortcomings such as these, plus the lack of support as detailed in The Terrorists, crafted by the duo who frequently wrote about their political socialist beliefs. A picture here is painted of a country that is not as much a utopia as previously projected. In this narrative by the writing duo, Rebecca's narrative is a subplot, which arguably prevents her from having enough agency or character development to shatter those rose-tinted glasses through which Scandinavia has been viewed, though. Here is where Naughty's fiction and Elizabeth Salander, standing at the centre of that, step in to pick up the mantle and become the revolutionary female antagonist that can begin to achieve this metaphorical shattering. Elizabeth, however, is very much a central character in Larsson's text, unlike Rebecca. A fact that is exemplified further in the English translation of the text that is named after her and her dragon tattoo, which highlights her instead of the hateful patriarchy as the key character in his trilogy. Elizabeth's experience is put under scrutiny in the trilogy, that explores how she is put under a declaration of incompetence, which means that she cannot control her finances, must comply to frequent check-ins, and has no freedom of movement. Her story, although at the centre of the narrative, is a cover-up for a larger event in which her father, a Soviet deserter and kingpin in the criminal underbelly of Sweden, murdered Elizabeth's mother. Elizabeth is declared incompetent to both hide his ties with the Soviet Union and to bury the truth about Elizabeth's mother via undermining Elizabeth as the one reliable source who knows the truth about him. In the same vein, it also protects the government, hiding their involvement in protecting Elizabeth's father. Via these methods, the utopian image of Sweden is maintained for those who view it from the outside here meaning both outside the government and outside the country. The corrupt nature of the government is kept under wraps, and Elizabeth is apparently being kept safe from herself. Should she speak out about her experience, her unusual and nonconformist appearance also ensures that those around her do not or cannot believe her. It is easier for Elizabeth to be undermined because of her physicality, isolating her and ensuring she remains on the outskirts of the utopian Swedish state. There are also suggestions throughout the trilogy, arguably made more believable because of her appearance, that she has mental health issues, anorexia, and even autism or Asperger's, which can be seen in the following quote, in which Elizabeth is first introduced through the eyes of her employer, Dragan Armansky, who runs a computer security and hacking company. Armansky's star researcher was a pale, anorexic young woman who had hair as short as a fuse and a pierced nose and eyebrows, with slender bones that made her look girlish and fine-limbed, with small hands, narrow wrists, and childlike breasts. This not only suggests that Elizabeth is childlike and so vulnerable, but that she is introduced as a top hacker in this extract suggests that she is incredibly good at computers, obsessive also, a trait commonly linked with autism or Asperger's, although this is not explicitly confirmed in the title. Her tattoos also mark her out as controversial, particularly for the late 90s, early noughties, when the text was written and published, and physicalise her unusual mindscape and the non-conformity that ultimately make her easier to undermine, but also allow her to expose the truth behind the utopian Sweden, by granting her a cynicism that allows her to see the utopia for what it is, which encourages her ultimately to fight and expose it. Elizabeth also has a wasp tattoo about 2 centimeters long on her neck, which marks her out as an inferior breed to the hornet, an ode to the title of the final book, The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. In this comparison, she is the underdog, unable to alter the corrupt system, the hornets, that allows her violent father to thrive, and Elizabeth herself to be undermined and to suffer monumental breaches of her own human rights. Ironically, this makes the male hornet figure, such as her father and the government, it makes them underestimate her, which ultimately leads to their downfall. Between the first and second books, Elizabeth goes to a clinic in Genoa to have the tattoo removed, not only removing the physical representation of her inferiority, but making her harder to identify. She regains a little of her inconspicuousness, which ultimately enables her to undermine the government who have been keeping tabs on her to maintain their own utopia, ultimately preventing Elizabeth from finding her own utopia. Yes, the appearance of Elizabeth, which marks her out as abnormal, is accredited as a side effect of her mental instability by both society and her Swedish government. However, Elizabeth ironically embraces her nature as an outcast or a loner, which can be seen in the first title when Elizabeth wears a black t-shirt with a picture of E.T. on it, with fangs and the words, "I am also an alien." She satirizes her own look again when she begins to work towards exposing the corruption in the government that led to her false declaration of incompetence. This is in the second title, The Girl Who Played with Fire, when she wore black lipstick, eyeliner, and dramatically prominent greenish-black eyeshadow. The rest of her face was covered in white makeup. She uses her appearance here to her advantage, to inspire fear and to manipulate those around her. On the flip side, she disguises her uniqueness to hide when she is being hunted in the second title, The Girl Who Played with Fire, blending in and going uncaught for the majority of the narrative. She uses and exploits her physicality, which represents her mentality, the way that those in the government have, but here to her advantage, to uncover and expose the corrupt patriarchal system that has crushed her for so long, turning her from the victim of the men who hate women into the woman who hates men who hate women. She here is a Gothic avenging angel who was her own saviour. She also uses her appearance in the extreme to portray a caricature of herself in the final title, The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. This caricature is utilised during a vast amount of the final book, in which Elizabeth dresses in an extreme manner while she is in court, not subduing her look or conforming. Even though Bloomfist was used to Salander's achievements for shocking clothing, he was amazed his sister, who is representing Elizabeth, has allowed her to turn up in the courtroom in a black leather miniskirt with frayed seams and a black top, with the legend, "I am annoyed," which barely covered her many tattoos. She had 10 piercings in her ears and rings through her lower lip and left eyebrow. Her head was covered in 3 months' worth of uneven stubble after her surgery. Ironically, this dramatic and aggressive image physicalizes the way in which the media have portrayed Elizabeth during the manhunt for her in the second title. Caricaturing herself this way works as a method to be honest, an honesty that perhaps has not been seen by these authorities and organizations and higher powers in the Scandinavian justice system, which ultimately leads the jury to believe in her and her authenticity, instead of seeing her as an unstable young woman she was portrayed as in the first 2 titles by the very government who have in fact been dishonest. Here, she contrasts the government dramatically. She represents the honesty that can only be portrayed by someone with such a unique and deeply seeing mindscape, someone who does not subscribe and conform to ensure they have a conventionally happy life in Stockholm, but rather seek justice. All that seems to matter to her throughout, and at this conclusion, is right and wrong, which is refreshing in the apparent utopia where right and wrong are often misconstrued for the sake of creating and maintaining the image of the utopia itself. Ironically, only someone with an unusual mindscape can expose this, as there is a lack of general understanding as to why the masses would submit and conform, much like the story of Rebecca in The Terrorists. Ultimately, it seems like a controversial mindscape is required to undermine this globally recognized utopia. But what really is the most controversial aspect of Elizabeth's mind? Arguably, clear and uncompromising view of what is morally right and wrong is the answer to this. Does this then suggest that the masses who can accept a rose-tinted view of something are immoral or unjust? Perhaps not, but arguably there needs to be a conviction to it that can only prevail if, like Elizabeth or Rebecca, one sees plainly, in black and white instead of rose, or rather rose-tinted. However, the masses have proven that they love the exposé of the Scandinavian welfare state, if not only by the hugely successful sales of the trilogy, which, according to The Guardian, is the 13th best-selling book of all time, that is the first book in the trilogy, but also by the high film sales of both the Swedish and the American English versions, which were released at very similar times. Either way, the success of a narrative that does a previously accepted utopia, shows a vision or mindscape of honesty, is a much more appreciated one, particularly in more recent years, even if that means experience corruption, grit, and violence to see what is plain and true, amid the production of a utopia that, for many, is an unattainable dream. Thank you very much for listening.